My fellow Ambazonians, dear citizens of our homeland, in the past 72 hours, my office was informed about the possibility of one of the parties in our conflict to declare unilateral ceasefire. My executive and my strategic team examined the circumstances that might arise from such a unilateral declaration. We waited until it was official before we could make a public reaction. We were informed by UN sources about that possibility. We were also aware through other media sources that Dr. Akwanga of the APLM was going to do a unilateral ceasefire. Let me state the following facts of history that will or should contextualize the current crisis between the state of Ambazonia and the state of Cameroon as an international conflict and not a non-international arms conflict. In 1919, the international border between Ambazonia and Cameroon was demarcated, affirmed in 1932. This international border gave Ambazonia an international personality. There is something also critical about international borders. It is based on the principle of uti possidetis juris. This is a principle that ensures that borders are frozen at independence, and that the borders you acquire at independence cannot unilaterally be extended through aggression or other form of illegal acquisition. So Ambazonia under international law is a sovereign state. This principle of uti possidetis was reaffirmed in Cairo in 1964 and enshrined in Article 4B of the African Union Constitutive Act that clearly states that countries cannot, in order to avoid conflict, unilaterally extend their borders they acquired at independence. It is also a historical fact that on the 1st of January 1960, Cameroon acquired independence within the territory defined by the Milner-Simon Agreement of 1919. That border was frozen at independence. Cameroon gained admission within those defined borders. You must be reminded, this principle has become a customary practice as a way of avoiding conflict between states, or to avoid the illegal extension of borders, illegal acquisition of territory. So the conflict between Cameroon and Ambazonia is an international conflict. Let me also make this clear to all those who have used the plebiscite of 11th of February 1961 to claim that Ambazonia, by that vote, surrendered its sovereignty or somehow allowed Cameroon's borders to be unfrozen. Be reminded that we ran a parliamentary democratic system where sovereignty rested in parliament. That means an act of vote as conducted by the United Nations on the 11th of February 1961 was simply an expression of the people of Ambazonia. That expression could only become an act that could be enforceable if it passed through the Ambazonian parliament and became an act of parliament voted into law by members of parliament. You must be reminded that never took place. And even the United Nations resolution of 15th of April 1961 that should have convened a post-plebiscite conference of the United Kingdom, the United Nations, Cameroon, Ambazonia, France, and other international actors to ensure that the outcome of the vote became a treaty signed between the state of Ambazonia and Cameroon never took place. And so Cameroon's extension of its border beyond that which it gained independence on the 1st of January 1960 is illegal, null and void. And it cannot, by prescription, articulation, or aggression, turn a de facto situation into a de jure one. And so our conflict is an international conflict that should be treated as such. That notwithstanding, I want you to know, even if it was a non-international conflict, Cameroon's unwillingness and incapability to resolve the conflict, creating a situation where refugees have moved out of our territory into neighboring countries, situates the conflict within the international realm, because it has, through the effect of the conflict, affected international security, international commerce, changed the political situation in neighboring countries. So it is now based on the international humanitarian crisis, based on Cameroon's inability to articulate or willingness to resolve the conflict, be treated as something that should be dealt with at the international realm. So I completely, on behalf of the Ambazonian Council, and rightly I speak for our people, reject the notion contained in the articulation of the APLM's declaration that our conflict is a non-international conflict. And let me remind each and everyone why declaring a unilateral ceasefire is dangerous, presumptuous, and an act of betrayal. First, by defining our conflict as a non-international conflict, Dr. Akwanga erased history, negated completely that Ambazonia acquired international personality in 1990, negated completely that we are the first country in Africa that established a democratic government, had 3 prime ministers through a free and fair election and a by-election, respectively. Negated completely the unilateralism of Cameroon in extending its border, using its military to dismantle our economic and political institutions. Negated completely the act of defiance of Fongoji Dinka, Alobode Ebong, justice, and Seseko Ayuk. By negating this history, you betrayed the sentiment of our people, those who have died and those who have resisted, to uphold certain basic principles and international norms, those who have sacrificed for the defense not only of our territorial integrity, but our international personality as an independent state. Independence was restored, proclaimed and reasserted, and this generation has a responsibility to defend, and that's what we're doing. In the past 3.5 years, my people, more than 1.5 million Ambazonians have been displaced internally and out of the country. This conflict, this war declared on us by Cameroon has affected more than 6 million Ambazonians. It has created a situation within our homeland that has set our economy back 10 years, that has stopped children from going to school. I've seen more than 500 villages burned. All through this period, we have called on the United Nations. We have called the attention of Secretary General Guterres on the humanitarian crisis and the root causes of this humanitarian crisis. They've maintained mute silence. They have prescribed cosmetic measures that has not been able to deal with the humanitarian situation. They have turned a blind eye to Cameroon's genocide within our homeland. They've sat quietly as international law, international treaty is violated. Cameroon has been committing war crimes, crimes against humanity. The United Nations has sat quiet. The international system has maintained the same indifference that has characterized the attitude in the dealing in the conflict between Cameroon and Ambazonia. What we have seen is a replay of the old movie that took us from being the first democracy in the continent of Africa to being an occupied state under an ill-fated, decadent political system, the most corrupt country in the world, the harbinger of instability in the Gulf of Guinea. When they prescribed the so-called negotiation between Cameroon and Ambazonia, their attitude was a replay of what they showed in 1961 after the 15th of April 1961 UN resolution calling for a post-plebiscite conference. They all came out to endorse the Swiss charade. I want to remind you, Ambazonians, one of the biggest problems we have faced as a people is that we've sold ourselves cheap. We've been impatient with reality. We have demonstrated a high sense of shallow reading of the way systems operate, actors act. We've been so cheap that leaders before us were dragged into conferences without knowing agendas. They articulated issues that were not properly studied. They excused themselves because of their level of education, the complex nature of a system they later understood. It is not the aggression of Cameroon that took us into near servitude. It is the shallowness and the inability of those who've led us before to understand the complex nature of the world and to speak more for Ambazonia than to articulate union with Cameroon or integration with Nigeria. That we've had few people who stood vehemently to speak for Ambazonia. We've had people in the past who betrayed the aspirations of the Ambazonian people by seeking quick fixes to situations that could have been studied and dealt with properly. And so when the Swiss so-called charade was called, we studied the articulations, we studied the posture, we studied the procedure, and we came to the conclusion that the Swiss charade was not designed to resolve the conflict between Ambazonia and Cameroon. It was designed to restore the status quo, restore peace without justice, and keep Ambazonia in perpetual servitude under Cameroon. We said this clearly to the Swiss. We said this clearly to the Americans. We told this clearly to the Europeans. We made it absolutely clear that we have watched this movie before. And the millions of our people displaced, those jailed, those who lost their lives, have not gone through this tragedy for the restoration of status quo ante that keeps us as slaves under an unstable, ill-fated, decadent political system. We rejected outrightly, but we didn't stop there. We presented to the international community an alternative procedure that will win the admiration not only of Cameroon and Ambazonians, but all those who are concerned with the resolution of the conflict. And I can assure you that they accepted the premise of our articulations and our presentations as a proper way of dealing with this conflict. We told them it was impossible for such a complex conflict to be allowed in the hands of the Swiss government alone, because our people do not trust Switzerland. But we compromised by saying we were prepared to move to Geneva to sign the final treaty of surrender. But the process of negotiation should be multilateral. We went further to connect Switzerland and other countries with other countries. They held discussions. My people. There are a lot of things that we cannot articulate out. But take note, we did not only reject what the Swiss presented, we presented an alternative that was accepted. We said the process must be multilateral. We did not only stop there, we presented countries to them. They entered into discussions. And we told them exactly how we could bring Ambazonian leaders together and how we could begin discussions. We didn't end there, Ambazonians. We went further. We told the world that sometimes discussing the root causes of conflict are difficult. So we may build confidence by starting to discuss issues like education. That Cameroon will stop from going into areas that we control, so that community educations can be supervised by agencies of the United Nations. We presented these plans to these agencies of the United Nations. We also told the world we could enter into discussions on issues of IDPs, how they could be protected. And we presented a plan for this. For all those who've attacked the Ambazonian Governing Council and its leadership for simply rejecting proposals, no, we do not simply reject proposals. We present viable alternatives that will stand the test of time. My people, we rush into Switzerland without doing our homework, without studying the act of the deal, without understanding the position of the international actors, without forcing Cameroon to commit, without putting the fate of our prisoners on the table, without talking about the plight of our people. We moved like sheep to the slaughter. And what happened? The same United Nations that is creating a unilateral ceasefire, the European Union, the Americans and the others immediately moved to support the Swiss process. This movie looks familiar. And why they did that was to put psychological pressure on the Ambazonian Governing Council to join that charade and to surrender the march to independence. We stood our ground despite the attacks, despite the blackmail, despite the sabotage. And we said, for all those who prefer this approach, you could move ahead. If the process was okay, and as I have said, I don't blame anyone. I blame the international system, and I blame the lack of commitment by Cameroon for the near collapse. But they haven't stopped there. The implications of a unilateral ceasefire are grave. We aren't simply fighting to defend the independence that was reaffirmed. We are also fighting to protect the lives of our people, to stop the genocide on our people, to protect our towns and villages from being burned down by the marauders army of a defeated system. We are trying to demonstrate, in the absence of the invocation of the responsibility to protect by the international system, our right under the sun to defend ourselves, protect our dignity and our lives. We are not only fighting to defend that independence, we are fighting to stay alive. And the declaration of unilateral ceasefire does not address the question of what happens to Cameroon's forces, does not prescribe how these forces will be stopped when they make moves like they did in Gabo to massacre people. Unilateral ceasefire is an abdication of duty, leaving your sentry a surrender in the face of genocide. And so when I come out again to reject it, you may call me names. You may say what you want to say. But I'll live and stand and die on principles that save the Ambazonian people. Issues that are properly discussed by policy teams articulated within the context of an international system which we have well studied. You must know, Cameroon is not an actor that has been restrained historically. Cameroon is not an actor that respects customary and treaty norms. Cameroon is a failed state, defeated in our homeland, and is using the last stance in our country to massacre our people. Our job as leaders is primarily to defend the interests of the Ambazonian people. Our job as leaders is primarily to stand for Ambazonia. And every leader must put Ambazonia first, the interest of our country first. This cosmetic approach of surrender in the face of pressure from an international system that has failed to invoke Kofi Annan's principle of POC, or the post-genocide Rwanda principle of responsibility to protect. It's not a system that can prescribe a solution at this particular stage. As leader of the Ambazonian Governing Council, leader of your war of independence, I call on our soldiers on the ground to raise your guns high in the air. Defend every inch, every block of our territory anytime. I call on the Ambazonian people to shift their focus on politicking and commit to the defense of our country. Commit to arming our people to the teeth to make sure the independence restored, proclaimed, and affirmed is defended. The lives of the Ambazonian people is defended. Go sign up on TTOF. Commit monthly for the defense of your country. As long as I live, we will never submit to any shallow political prescription that does not have as intention the withdrawal of Cameroon from our country, the total freedom of Ambazonia, the release of our prisoners, and the bringing back of our IDPs and refugees in the land of their birth. We will not submit to a system and a process that rob us of sovereignty and control of our territorial integrity. God bless Ambazonia, a luta continua, Victoria Aseta.